In the tumultuous winter of 1969, a relentless nor'easter paralyzed the American Northeast for 4 straight days, humbling the machinery of modern life and creating a surreal, frozen pause in a decade defined by chaos and noise. 1969 was a year of fire, Vietnam, civil rights, the moon landing, and cultural revolution. But in late February, the narrative froze. The 100-hour snowstorm revisits the legendary nor'easter that dumped record-breaking snow from Maine to Maryland. Through 8mm home movies and archival newsreels, we explore how a massive meteorological event exposed the fragility of our infrastructure and the resilience of our neighborhoods. It is a story of stranded motorists, political fallout that ended careers, and the eerie, beautiful silence that fell over the loudest cities on Earth. It started on a Sunday night. The weatherman said it would be nothing, a dusting, maybe a nuisance for the morning commute. We went to bed thinking about the work week, about the bills, about the war. And while we slept, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray, and the winds shifted from the northeast. By morning, the world we knew, the world of asphalt, steel, and schedules, was gone. This isn't a story about weather, not really. Weather is what happens when you forget your umbrella. This is a story about a siege, a 100-hour siege where nature reclaimed the American Northeast. From the rocky coast of Maine to the gritted streets of Queens, the snow didn't just fall, it accumulated like history itself, layer upon heavy layer. It buried the cars. It buried the fire hydrants. It buried the very idea that we were in control. Look at this footage. That's the Massachusetts Turnpike, usually a river of steel and gasoline. Here, it's a ghost town. That's Broadway in Manhattan. No taxis, just a lone figure on cross-country skis, gliding past the marquees. For those of us who were there, the memory isn't cold. It's actually warm. It's the memory of the silence. The way the snow muffled the city soundscape until you could hear your own heartbeat. It was the moment the internal combustion engine lost the argument, and for a few short days, we all just stopped. History usually moves at a breakneck speed, and if there was ever a year that had its foot pinned to the floorboard, it was 1969. But then, in the dying days of February, the sky over the Northeast turned a peculiar, bruised shade of slate gray, and the noise stopped. It didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a relentless, soft accumulation. For 100 hours, a low-pressure system parked itself off the coast of New England and refused to leave. It was a nor'easter in the technical sense, but to those of us who lived through it, it felt more like a correction. A divine intervention that decided the American century needed a timeout. From the Potomac to the Penobscot, the modern world was erased. The cars that defined our status, buried under drifts that reached the second-story windows. The schedules that ruled our lives, rendered meaningless. In New York City, the capital of the world, 42nd Street looked like a canyon on the moon. No taxis, no buses, just the wind, howling through the steel valleys. For 4 days, the most powerful nation on earth was brought to its knees by frozen water. But ask anyone who was there. Ask them about the 100-hour storm. They won't tell you about the cold. They'll tell you about the silence. The eerie, beautiful silence that settled over the suburbs and the cities alike. It was the only time in the entire decade that America actually sat still. We were trapped, we were cold, but for a few fleeting days we were all in it together, huddled around transistor radios, waiting for the plow that wouldn't come. Sunday, February 9th, 1969. It started with a lie, or, if not a lie, a spectacular miscalculation. The morning papers in New York and Boston called for rain, maybe changing to flurries. It was the kind of forecast that made you put on a trench coat, not a parka. People went to church. They went to the diner for eggs and coffee. They planned their commute for Monday morning. But while the East Coast was reading the Sunday funnies, a meteorological collision was happening 300 miles south off the coast of North Carolina. In the weather business, they call it cyclogenesis. I call it bad chemistry. You had a mass of freezing Arctic air diving down from Canada, dry, bitter, and heavy. At the same time, a low-pressure system loaded with moisture was steaming up from the Gulf of Mexico, riding the warm currents of the Gulf Stream. Usually, the jet stream acts like a bouncer, kicking these storms out into the open Atlantic, where they just churn up waves for the lobster boats. But on this specific Sunday, the bouncer took a break. A massive high-pressure ridge over the Canadian Maritimes acted like a brick wall. It blocked the exit. The storm, which had formed off Cape Hatteras, hit that wall and had nowhere to go. So it stalled. It spun like a top, sucking up millions of tons of Atlantic seawater, freezing it instantly, and turning it into a white hurricane. The weathermen were looking at primitive satellite photos and teletype data that was hours old. They saw the storm, sure, but they didn't see the stall. They were playing checkers while the Atlantic Ocean was playing chess. By early afternoon, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The rain in the city turned to slush, and the slush turned to ice. The wind shifted to the northeast, picking up that distinct, hollow roar that sailors know better than suburbanites. The barometer began to crash, and that rain the forecast promised, it started coming down as heavy, wet snow. Not the drifting kind, the concrete kind. The kind that sticks to the telephone wires until they snap. The trap was set, the door was locked, and the key was thrown into a snowbank. When the sun went down on Sunday, the volume went up. By 8 p.m., the accumulation wasn't measured in inches anymore. It was measured in feet. The storm had intensified into a bomb cyclone, a term we use freely now, but back then, it just felt like the sky was falling in chunks. This is where the ambush turned into a siege. The snowfall rates hit 3, sometimes 4 inches an hour. You have to understand the physics of that. A standard municipal plow in 1969, big, heavy steel beasts running on diesel and grit, could clear a lane, turn around, and by the time it came back, that lane was gone. Erased. The Department of Sanitation wasn't clearing the roads. They were just rearranging the drifts. Then came the thunder. It's a rare phenomenon called thundersnow. The atmospheric pressure was dropping so violently that the sky literally cracked open. Imagine driving a Ford Galaxy down the Long Island Expressway, barely seeing the hood ornament through the whiteout, and suddenly the gray void flashes violet, followed by a boom that rattles your fillings. It felt biblical. Civilization began to blink out, one grid at a time. First, the airports surrendered. JFK, LaGuardia, Newark, closed tight. Thousands of travelers were stranded in terminals that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and floor wax, watching the runways disappear. Then, the arteries clogged. On the Tappan Zee Bridge in the Jersey Turnpike, the traffic slowed to a crawl, then a halt. Cars weren't just stuck, they were being buried where they idled. You had executives in wool suits and factory guys in work boots, all sitting in their cold metal boxes, watching the gas gauge drop, realizing they weren't making it home for bonanza. The wind started gusting to 50, 60 miles an hour. It took that heavy, wet snow and sculpted it into drifts that defied gravity. It plastered street signs, covered hydrants, and sealed up doorways. By midnight, the city that never sleeps was being forced into a coma. The police switchboards lit up like Christmas trees, heart attacks, stranded motorists, power lines down, but the ambulances couldn't move. The greatest infrastructure on Earth, the engine of the American century, was being defeated by frozen water. If Sunday night was the violence, Monday morning was the peace. It was the silence that hit you first. If you've ever lived in the Northeast Corridor, Boston, New York, Philly, you know the background hum of the American machine. It never stops. But on the morning of February 10th, 1969, the machine was unplugged. The acoustics of the world had changed. That deep, insulating blanket of snow absorbed every sound. No tire hum on the pavement, no distant sirens, no airplanes overhead. Just the blood rushing in your ears and the sound of your own breath steaming in the cold air. We woke up to a moonscape. In the suburbs of Long Island in Connecticut, front doors wouldn't open. You had to climb out a window to shovel the doorway. The family station wagon wasn't just stuck, it was gone, transformed into a soft white mound indistinguishable from the shrubbery. The geography of the neighborhood had been erased. The property lines, the curbs, the sidewalks, all gone. It was just one continuous rolling white ocean. And then the magic set in. The realization. The radio announcers, the ones who had actually made it into the studio, were reading the closure lists. It wasn't just schools, it was everything. The New York Stock Exchange, closed. The UN, closed. For the first time in history, the mail didn't go through. For a brief, shining moment before the back-breaking labor of the dig-out began, it was a carnival. People reclaimed the streets. Fifth Avenue wasn't a gridlock of yellow checkers. It was a cross-country ski run. You saw bankers in galoshes and wool trench coats sledding down the on-ramps of the LIE. In Boston, students were jumping out of second-story dorm windows into 6-foot drifts. There was a sudden, strange camaraderie. The social barriers of 1969, the tension between the hard hats and the hippies, the suits and the kids, seemed to dissolve under the snow. Strangers helped strangers push cars. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were sharing thermoses of coffee over fences that were now buried. It felt like a truce. The war in Vietnam, the inflation, the riots of the previous year, they were all happening somewhere else, on some other planet. Here it was just bright sun, blue sky, and a world made clean. We didn't know it yet, but this was the last deep breath before the suffocation set in. To understand why this storm scarred the psyche of the Northeast so deeply, you have to understand the specific arrogance of 1969. This was the apex of the American century. We were 5 months away from putting a man on the moon. We had the Boeing 747. We had split the atom. We had built the interstate highway system, the greatest engineering project in human history. The prevailing belief was that we had conquered the physical world through sheer industrial will. But the 100-hour snowstorm exposed a crack in the foundation. It revealed that our entire post-war way of life was built on a single, fragile assumption: mobility. Since 1945, we had been redesigning our civilization around the automobile. We built sprawling suburbs like Levittown and commuter havens in Jersey, places where you couldn't walk to a grocery store because there were no sidewalks, only shoulders for cars. We dismantled the trolley lines and bet everything on the combustion engine. When the snow trapped those cars, it didn't just stop traffic, it severed the lifeline of modern society. Suddenly, the modern convenience of the suburbs felt like isolation. The just-in-time delivery systems for supermarkets, a new concept back then, collapsed. Fresh milk and bread vanished from shelves within hours. The oil trucks couldn't get through to refill the furnaces. And in those drafty, wood-frame colonial houses, the temperature began to drop. And then there was the class divide, stark and white against the pavement. In Manhattan, Mayor John Lindsay, tall, handsome, the quintessential limousine liberal, was photographed walking to City Hall, looking dashing in his winter gear. For the wealthy in the city center, the storm was an inconvenience, or even a lark. But in the outer boroughs, in Queens, in Staten Island, in the blue-collar strongholds, it was a disaster. These were the homes of the silent majority, the people Nixon was courting. They watched their televisions and saw the plows clearing Fifth Avenue, while their own streets remained buried under 4 feet of ice. The storm ceased to be a weather event and became a metaphor for the fracturing of America. It highlighted the disconnect between the planners and the people, the city and the suburb, the elite and the working class. Mother Nature had pulled the curtain back on the Great Society, and we realized just how thin the safety net really was. By day 3, the novelty had worn off. The winter wonderland had curdled into something claustrophobic. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase. It was a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest. In the outer boroughs and the suburbs of Long Island, the silence of the falling snow was replaced by a low-grade hum of resentment. You have to remember, this was 1969. The country was already a powder keg. Vietnam, civil rights, the assassinations of '68. The fuse was already lit. The snow just provided the match. The epicenter of this shift was Fresh Meadows, Queens. While Manhattan sipped cocktails in hotel bars, Queens had been erased from the map. No plows, no milk trucks, no ambulances, just 42 inches of indifference. On Tuesday, February 11th, Mayor John Lindsay decided to tour the affected areas. He climbed into his limousine, a dark, sleek symbol of City Hall authority, and headed toward the boroughs to show he cared. It was a fatal political miscalculation. When his motorcade reached 188th Street, he didn't find grateful citizens waiting to be rescued. He found a blockade. It wasn't a riot in the traditional sense. It was middle-class dads in galoshes and moms in wool coats. They were exhausted, they were cold, and they were done waiting. They dragged trash cans into the street. They parked their buried cars diagonally. They formed a human chain. When Lindsay got out of the car, the sky fell on him. They called him a bum. They screamed about their taxes. A woman reportedly told him, "You get the plow first, then you get the vote." Legend has it, snowballs hit the limousine, though some say it was just ice and slush kicked up by the tires. But the symbolism was undeniable. This was the transformation. The storm was no longer a natural disaster. It was a management crisis. It was the moment the Lindsay Blizzard earned its name. The cameras caught it all. The footage of the handsome, progressive mayor being heckled by his own constituents beamed into living rooms across the tri-state area. It shattered the illusion of control. The snow had equalized the landscape, but it had radicalized the homeowner. We realized that when the chips were down, or when the drifts were high, civilization is a lot thinner than the asphalt it's built on. There is a specific weight to snow when it has been sitting for 3 days. It changes state. It stops being precipitation and starts becoming geology. Meteorologists call it settling. But the men in the driveways of Long Island, New Jersey, and Westchester knew it by a different name, the Widowmaker. By Wednesday, the temperature rose slightly, just enough to turn that 42 inches of powder into layers of wet, dense concrete, and out came the shovels. You have to picture the demographic of the 1969 homeowner. This was the era of the 3-martini lunch, the pack-a-day habit, and the steak and potatoes diet. These were men who spent their weeks sitting in frantic traffic or behind desks, suddenly thrust into the most violent physical exertion of their lives. Lift, twist, throw, repeat. Doctors called it the heart attack snow. The hospitals that were accessible were overwhelmed not by frostbite, but by coronaries. In the first 48 hours of the cleanup alone, 42 people died in the New York metropolitan area. Most of them were found clutching snow shovels. It was a silent massacre in the suburbs, happening behind the manicured hedges and split-rail fences. But the paralysis wasn't just biological, it was mechanical. The region's economic arteries had hardened. For the first time in history, the New York Stock Exchange closed solely due to weather. But the real ghost town was out at JFK and LaGuardia. Aviation was the crown jewel of the 1960s. The jet age was at its peak. But for 3 days, the skies over the eastern seaboard were empty. Thousands of travelers were stranded in terminals that had turned into refugee camps. No flights out, no food trucks in. The glamour of the Pan Am era evaporated instantly when you were sleeping on a linoleum floor using your briefcase as a pillow, splitting a stale candy bar with a stranger. The supply chain snapped. In the grocery stores that managed to open, the shelves were stripped bare within the hour. No milk, no bread, no fuel oil deliveries. The modern American machine, usually so efficient, so unstoppable, had been brought to its knees by frozen water. We realized then that our post-war prosperity had a fragility to it. We had built a society dependent on constant motion, on the just-in-time arrival of goods and services. When the motion stopped, the comfort vanished. We weren't citizens of a superpower anymore. We were just cold mammals waiting for a thaw. When the official infrastructure collapsed, a strange thing happened. The hierarchy of the suburbs collapsed with it. For 3 days, your job title, your bank account, and the make of your car didn't matter. The only currency that held any value on Long Island in February 1969 was a strong back, a working snowblower, and a bottle of scotch. We witnessed a spontaneous eruption of what sociologists call disaster utopia. But to the kids dragging flexible flyer sleds down the middle of the Long Island Expressway, it just felt like freedom. The silence of the stopped city was broken not by sirens, but by the revving of two-stroke engines. This was the moment the snowmobile, previously a toy for the rural backwoods of Maine or Minnesota, became the hero of the suburbs. Volunteer fire departments and local teenagers mobilized a ragtag cavalry of ski-doos. They were the only things moving. They ran insulin to diabetics in Levittown. They delivered milk to trapped families in Queens. There are stories of doctors being ferried to emergency deliveries on the backs of snowmobiles, skimming over the tops of buried station wagons. On the residential blocks, the isolation turned into a party. You have to remember, 1969 was a tense year. The country was tearing itself apart over Vietnam, over civil rights, over the generation gap. But under 2 feet of snow, the shouting matches stopped. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years met at the property line, shovels in hand. The fences were gone, buried under the drifts, so the boundaries disappeared too. People pooled their resources. If you had eggs and the guy next door had bread, you had breakfast. The siege mentality took hold, but it wasn't fearful. It was festive. With the offices closed and the phones dead, the snow day ceased to be just for children. The liquor cabinets opened at noon. Impromptu block parties broke out in the cleared patches of asphalt. We saw grandmothers walking down the center of major boulevards on cross-country skis. We saw businessmen hitchhiking on toboggans. For 72 hours, the rigid, clockwork discipline of the American workforce was suspended. We were forced to slow down, to look at each other, and to simply exist in the whiteout. It was a brief, frozen armistice. The modern world had failed us, yes, but we found out that we hadn't failed each other. If the blizzard brought out the best in the neighbors, it brought out the absolute worst in the politics. As the adrenaline faded and the hangovers set in, a new emotion took hold of the outer boroughs: rage. You have to understand the geography of class in 1969 New York. Manhattan was the gleaming center, the place of commerce and theater. Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx were where the workers lived. And when the sun finally came out, the workers looked at their televisions and saw a pristine, plowed Fifth Avenue, while they were still tunneling out of their front doors like badgers. The snowstorm ceased to be a weather event and became a cultural wedge. It birthed what we now call the outer borough mentality, that deep-seated suspicion that the guys in charge don't care about the little guy at the end of the subway line. The defining image of this legacy isn't the snow itself. It's Mayor John Lindsay, the limousine liberal, trying to tour Fresh Meadows, Queens, 3 days after the storm. He didn't get a hero's welcome. He got heckled. He got booed. Women screamed at him from second-story windows. A city plow truck, meant to clear the way for the mayor's limo, actually broke down right in front of the angry mob. You couldn't write a script that perfect. That moment changed the American expectation of government forever. Before February 1969, a blizzard was considered an act of God, something you endured with grit. After February 1969, an unplowed street was an act of negligence. The Lindsay storm, as it came to be known, destroyed the idea of the benevolent city father. It taught a generation of Americans that nature might be cruel, but bureaucracy was indifferent. The romantic isolation was gone, replaced by a ledger of grievances. Culturally, it left a scar. For decades, 1969 became shorthand in the Northeast. It was the benchmark against which all other misery was measured. If you survived the 100-hour storm, you had tenure. You had bragging rights. It became a grim badge of honor for the baby boomers, a story told at every Thanksgiving whenever a flake of snow hit the ground. You think this is bad? You should have seen the drifts on the LIE. We lost our innocence regarding the infrastructure that supports us. We realized just how thin the veneer of civilization really was, and how quickly the social contract could freeze over. Walk into a grocery store in the Northeast today, when the forecast calls for 2 inches of flurries, and you will see a panic that would baffle the survivors of 1969. We call it the French toast alert, the inexplicable collective urge to strip the shelves of bread, milk, and eggs at the first mention of a polar vortex. This is the modern legacy of the 100-hour storm. We have swung the pendulum from stoic unpreparedness to hyper-vigilant anxiety. Today, a storm like the one in '69 wouldn't sneak up on us like a thief in the night. It would be tracked, named, and branded a week in advance. We have the Super Doppler 5000s, the spaghetti models, and the 24-hour cable news tickers screaming in bright red fonts. We don't just experience weather anymore, we consume it as content. The mystery is gone, replaced by a cone of uncertainty. And look at the streets. Because of what happened to John Lindsay, no mayor in America dares to be caught sleeping. The response has been militarized. Before the first flake hits the asphalt, the brine trucks are out, pre-treating the interstates with a chemical glaze. We have GPS-tracked fleets of plows that you can follow on a smartphone app, seeing exactly when they pass your driveway. It is a marvel of logistics, an absolute triumph of municipal engineering. But in this rush to ensure commerce never stops, we've killed the snow day. In 1969, the storm was a hard stop. The world physically ceased to function. You couldn't go to work. You couldn't go to school. You were forced into that beautiful, quiet pause. Today, if the roads are blocked, you log into Zoom. If the power lines hold, the emails keep coming. The distinction between home and office has dissolved, and with it, the permission to do absolutely nothing. We have engineered a world where the weather is no longer an excuse. We have salt for the roads and Wi-Fi for the living rooms, ensuring that the great machine of productivity never has to skip a beat. The 100-hour storm was a shared physical reality. The modern storm is a digital event. We sit inside, warm and dry, scrolling through photos of other people's snow on Instagram, connected to everything but the silence outside our window. We are safer, certainly. We are warmer, definitely. But looking at the pristine, blacktop pavement of a modern post-storm highway, you have to wonder if we haven't plowed away a little bit of the magic too. There is a profound humility in looking back at February 1969. In an era defined by the space race, when we were quite literally shooting for the moon and splitting the atom, a simple atmospheric collision of moisture and cold air brought the center of the world to its knees. The 100-hour storm wasn't just a weather event, it was a reality check. It served as a stark reminder of a truth we Americans often try to engineer our way out of. Nature always holds the veto power. For 4 days, the social hierarchy of the Northeast collapsed. The snow didn't care about your tax bracket, your zip code, or your political affiliation. A Cadillac stuck in a drift was just as useless as a city bus. The executive on Wall Street was just as cold and just as stranded as the longshoreman in Red Hook. When the machinery of the state ground to a halt, something primal and necessary took its place. The great equalizer stripped away the armor of urban isolation. You couldn't just walk past your neighbor anymore. You had to dig them out. We talk about the chaos, sure, but ask the people who were there, and they'll tell you about the silence. That rare, muffled quiet that falls over a city when the combustion engines die. They'll tell you about the surreal beauty of walking down the absolute center of Fifth Avenue on cross-country skis, reclaiming the public space from the automobile. It was an involuntary festival of cooperation. Strangers pushed strangers' cars. Teenagers delivered groceries to the elderly on sleds. For one brief, frozen moment, the rugged individualism of the American ethos was replaced by a forced, shivering communalism. We realize that when the lights go out and the roads disappear, all we really have is each other. In our modern quest for frictionless living, for the heated driveway and the seamless delivery, we have largely succeeded in keeping the elements at bay. But we've also built walls. We've lost the shared vulnerability that binds a community together. The 100-hour storm was a disaster, yes, but it was also a moment when we were fully, undeniably present in the world and in the lives of the people right next door. By the first week of March 1969, the mountains of snow in downtown Boston and Manhattan had turned into gray, weeping slush. The submerged cars were dug out, their batteries jumped, their engines sputtering back to life. The plows finally scraped down to the asphalt, and the hum of American industry resumed its frantic pace. But the 100-hour storm left a watermark that never quite evaporated. In many ways, that February blizzard was a curtain call for a specific kind of American life. It was perhaps the last time we were truly allowed to stop. Today we have Doppler radar, heated pavement, and a digital tether that ensures work follows us into the eye of the storm. We don't get snow days anymore, not really. We just shift to remote servers and keep the wheels turning. We've engineered away the inconvenience, but we've also engineered away the magic. That's why we keep telling this story. It's not just about the accumulation totals or the wind speeds. It's about the memory of a world that could still be paused. It's about the nostalgia for a time when the only light in the living room came from a fireplace, not a smartphone screen. When the only status update was a neighbor knocking on the door to see if you had enough milk. Those who lived through it are older now. The kids who dove off second-story porches into snowdrifts are grandparents. The young couples who walk down the silent center of the Jersey Turnpike are retirees. But look in their eyes when they talk about February '69. You won't see fear, you'll see a sparkle. You'll see the reflection of a white, silent world where, for 4 glorious days, the clock stopped ticking. History moves fast. It buries the past just as surely as that storm buried the Northeast. But every once in a while, when the sky turns that heavy, bruised shade of gray, and the first flake lands on the hood of a car, we look up. We hold our breath. And we hope, just for a second, that nature might win again.